Thank you so much for being here. Manny is a VC from Osage University partner. He's a partner, and Dror Futter is also he's a partner at Rimon Law, and he specializes in startups and investors and small to medium tech startups. Before we start this webinar, I'd like to invite Mark to talk a little bit about our program at NSF I-Corps. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, great. And again, thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you guys are enjoying the really nice winter wonderland outside. The snow is coming down, it's beautiful. So thank you for joining us today instead of shoveling snow or playing with your kids in the snow, but that'll come later. Again, I'm Mark de Guzman. I'm one of the program managers for the NSF I-Corps Northeast Hub, and welcome to Entrepreneurship Essentials. Just a quick overview about the NSF I-Corps Northeast Hub. I know that there are some people who are still joining the Zoom a little bit, so hopefully they'll trickle in, and Vanessa, you can help let people in. But our hub is funded by the National Science Foundation. It's across the region, which includes 4 states: Delaware, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And we have it's the National Innovation Network, and we're really trying to expand the innovation ecosystem in our region. We have 10 university partners, and we serve any researcher and entrepreneur in the Northeast region. We deliver I-Corps training programs to help scientists think like entrepreneurs. We prepare them for National I-Corps, and we study the research impacts of the entrepreneurship. And we have recent news announcement that UConn, University of Connecticut, just recently joined our hub to make it 11 institutions in our region. Again, the hub is led by Princeton University with partner institutions, including Rutgers and the others institutions here. So congratulations to UConn for joining us. And so I-Corps will really help explore the potential of your innovation or your idea to make impactful products and services that can benefit society. If you go through the regional program, each team is able to use up to $3,000 for customer discovery activities. You get access to our really top quality mentors from seasoned entrepreneurs, our teaching team. Again, it's a really top quality group of people who really want to help and support you in your commercialization efforts, and then you can accelerate towards the National I-Corps program or SBIR. So this is just a brief map. Oops, sorry. This is a map of the innovation journey, right? So first you have your innovation or your idea, then you apply for the regional I-Corps program, where you get up to $3,000. If you're successful, you can go advance forward towards the national I-Corps program. But now this purple here is the startup area, and this is where Manny and Dror will talk to us a little bit about, when you create the startup in terms of distributing the equity agreements. And then you can go to SBIR, Phase 1 and Phase 2, angel investment and venture capital. Again, a lot of people in this call are different stages on this journey, so we hope that we can help guide you along this path. And so what makes an I-Corps team? Typically you have a technical lead who's the inventor. It's a faculty member or a researcher, postdoctoral associate. And they are really understanding the deep technical aspects of the innovation. The entrepreneur lead, who's really the star of the I-Corps program, is a student, grad student, or postdoc who can really explore the commercial potential, and they're really committed to understanding what the market needs are. And there's an industry mentor, someone who's an experienced entrepreneur, or someone has experience in commercializing technologies before. The technical lead and the entrepreneur lead are required for our regional I-Corps program, but the industry mentor is not required for the regional, but it is required for the national I-Corps program. So hopefully through the regional program, you can find an industry mentor that you can go with you for national I-Corps. We also have a really entry-level opportunity for students from underrepresented groups to join I-Corps teams called the I-Corps Fellowship Program. So, you can use a QR code here. We'll give the links in the chat later on. But the idea is if you're innovation-minded and you want to be matched with an I-Corps team for a $1,000 stipend, please sign up for the fellowship, and we can try to match you based on your interests and the teams who have applied. So the next opportunity, we have the virtual cohort coming up in April. The deadline is March 12th These are Tuesday, Friday mornings from April 2 to April 26th. This is virtual. This is for everybody in the hub. We also have a Princeton cohort coming up. I think the deadline there is March 4th, which runs from March 25th to April 17th in the evenings from 4 to 7 p.m. And I think UConn also has an upcoming cohort as well. The deadline is February 26th. I didn't have a chance to put it on here, but you can reach out to Alicia or Michelle to find out more information. And we could put that information in the chat later. But basically, this is our hub, and we want you to stay engaged with us for more of our content. Definitely reach out to us. We want to help you succeed in your innovation journey. So sign up for our event page. You can check out the newsletter and use any of these links, especially the website. Okay, without further ado, so that's fine. Without further ado, I do want to introduce Manny, Stockman, and Dror Futter to share with us their information on Founders Equity. Okay, thanks.
Great. Well, I'll just go ahead and get started, I think. So thanks everyone for joining today. We're going to kick things off with me talking a little bit about what we've seen as the type of typical structures that are appropriate for the founding equity cap table for a university spin out. And then Dror will follow up with some more of the structural things to be thinking about from a legal perspective when you do so. But I just want to pause and say thank you everyone for joining. It's not, as Dror put it before everyone joined, like everyone's locked in with the snow, so it's kind of been a nice captive audience, and the turnout looks great. So I love having questions as we go, and just feel free to ask them, and I'll try and pay attention to the Q&A. But Stephanie and Mark, if you guys want to moderate, interrupt me, feel free to do so. So let me share my slides. And let me know if you cannot see them. Give me a thumbs up, maybe. Mark, can you see the slides?
Yeah, we see them.
Good. Okay, great. So I'm a partner at OUP. We invest in startups that spin out of university research. And I've been doing this for about 8 years. Our fund has been around for about 14 years. And I just, not meant to be a plug for us, but we only invest in startups that spin out of university research. And some of the data that you're going to see is reflective of our experience in having done that and some of our learnings along the way. And we work with universities all across the country. And so it's also geographically spread as well. Just to kind of lay the groundwork, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think some of you may have already been exposed to founders equity and ownership. But the basic things to be thinking about when you're building a startup at the early days, because you're often, rejecting a real kind of job at a real company that's been around for a while with a decent salary in lieu of equity, you need to also be thinking about what happens to that equity over time. Equity is how much you own of the company. And it typically only goes down if you're a venture-backed startup because you're trying to grow your valuation and create a really big company. And your ownership is going to be how much of that company exit dollars you have in the end, which hopefully is a life-changing event. I mean, it can be really significant for some people. And in the process of doing that, you're raising venture capital. And these are just some of the terms that you should be aware of when you raise venture capital to understand the dilution, the change in your equity ownership over time. And these are basic things like pre-money valuation. What's your company worth today? Post-money, when an investor gives you a term sheet. Post-money valuation, what's your company worth after you invest, after an investor invests? Fully diluted is all of the shares that exist for the company. Preferred stock is the amount of the stock that VCs buy, venture capitalists and other investors purchase, which is of a different class of stock than founders' equity. And the key thing to keep in mind is in almost all cases, preferred stock exits and sells their shares first in a liquidation event. Not going to get into that today, but it's really important to understand. And then common stock. This is typically what founders' shares are, and common stock is the same type of stock that founders own, that option holders purchase if they convert their options. And it's typically the way you incentivize employees to join your company is by giving them options to buy common stock over time. And the reason why these terms are important is this isn't rocket science here, but this is kind of the way math works in understanding how your founder's equity, your ownership of a company changes over time. When you raise capital, typically an investor will give you a term sheet for an amount of dollars they want to invest in the company, the capital raise, and a pre-money valuation and a post-money valuation. The dilution of your ownership is that simple first equation. Let's call it typically maybe 30%. You raise $3 million on 33%, $3 million on a $6 million pre, which is a $9 million post. And so your dilution is 33%. If you own 100% of that company before the round, your pre-money ownership is 100%. After the money comes in, you've sold 33% of your company. And so your post-money ownership is going to be around 66%. And so when you think of, if you want to minimize the impact on your ownership, what you want to do is minimize dilution. You want to minimize how much capital you need to raise and maximize your post-money valuation, maximize your value. And these two things they run opposite from each other for many reasons. You need capital to do the things you want to do at your company, buy equipment, pay your employees over time, and other expenses associated with running a business. So you need a certain amount of capital to raise. But your valuation is a function of some very specific things. What progress have you made? What's your product like? What's your team's experience and the market? And so these things all go into the kind of hand-wavy math that venture investors do to decide your valuation. And the capital raise is really determined on what you can need to raise to get to the next point. And you can raise the smallest amount possible, but it doesn't get you to a significant enough point or milestone achievement for your next raise. So typically think of capital raises in terms of getting your company 18 months forward. And so you're not raising all the time because it's exhausting, and gets you to a point where you can actually increase your valuation by a significant amount. So these are just some kind of very rough ways to think about things. It's not not the main purpose of our talk today. The main purpose of our talk today is to think about what's the right way to initiate your company from an equity perspective amongst founders. And so when we often think about this as a venture firm, for the very early day zero type structure of a company, we kind of think of things in three buckets. There's the co-founders. There's the co-founders. Usually it's out of universities. It's a few of the researchers involved. It's a co-founder who is going to be contributing significantly to the company, and it's the team. 2 to 3 people in that co-founder employee bucket, and they're typically about 40% of the cap table. The cap table is the ledger of ownership. But then you have this other large bucket, this 40% bucket, which is not always, we'll get into this more in a couple slides. It's typically the person who's really driving the company forward every single day, 80 hours a week, thinking about things beyond the technology, living the fundraising trail. Maybe they've come from the outside. Hopefully they've actually come from the outside if they're going to be getting this large of an equity award. And they're the long-term CEO of the company. And if you don't have that person, you still need to think about in the future when they're going to come in, them having a significant portion of your company. There's also a 20% bucket, which at the very earliest days of your company is your option pool. And that option pool is the equity incentive that you're going to use to hire employees. Not just rank and file employees, maybe your VP of product, director of engineering, but also your software engineers, your designers, things like that, at the early days of the company, they might be getting a couple percent of your option pool as a part of, how you need them to help you grow the company. And it needs to be a lot of your company because they're turning away a salary that they might be able to get from Google for several $100,000 a year, and you're not going to pay them that. So you need to reward them with options, and that's part of building a company. you need to give up equity, both to your employees and to your venture investors who are investing in the company. And I thought it'd be good to discuss what happens if you don't do this right. And that pie chart is not helpful enough to be the right way, but it's good to be thinking about ways that it can go wrong. And, breaking it down to a couple different buckets here, when you think of your founder's equity, the people you're going to, work with over the next several years, maybe a decade or more, building this company, it's good to think about a few things. One is you can have parasitic founders. These are people who you were hopefully great friends with when you started the company, but don't contribute to the company in the long run. And the reason why that's important is because it's hard over time when your equity gets diluted to see someone who's sitting maybe with the same equity that you are, that hasn't been pouring in their life's work into the company every day like you have over the last several years. And so once you've granted that equity, you can't take it back. There's maybe Dror will hit this, but there is a really important structure to put on founders' equity. And you would typically have it be vested. There's lots of different ways to do it. I always just say, make sure you speak to a lawyer and just do it right. And put the right legal terms on your founders' equity so that everyone feels comfortable that contributions to the company are rewarded. And then, the other issue of not assigning your equity appropriately is when you have a lack of equity for compensation. So I mentioned earlier that you want to leave this roughly 20% of your company in the early days for hiring. Now, fast forward 2 years into your company's existence, the graduate student you co-founded the company with has left. He has his entire equity position still remaining because it's founders' equity and you didn't set it up with a vesting schedule. You've also drained your option pool from 20% down to 1%. So you don't have any options to give new hires. And you need to replace the person that just left, your co-founder, because they were really significant to the company. And the only way to do that is to increase your option pool, which dilutes everybody. And so you have to really be careful about how you assign and allocate equity, because it affects a lot of what you do in developing the next set of hires you have for the institution. Other things like, let's say you do realize these problems, you say, oh, well, I can just fix this. It's really hard to fix a bad cap table. What you would do in that situation where there's a parasitic founder or parasitic equity holder on your cap table is you have to dilute everybody. You can't just remove a single person easily from your cap table. And when investors want to do it, when they're thinking about it, it's really painful because you have to bring everyone basically down to zero and then build them back up. And investors, no matter how excited they are for about a company, if they see a messed up cap table, it's just one more reason for them to walk away from the deal. So it's really important to think about these issues and just be aware that doing it right at the first moment is the best thing you can do. And always talk to a lawyer about it, and also talk to your tech transfer office at the institutions, because they deal with this every day. I'm looking at a couple of the questions. So someone asked, how do you protect equity to co-founders and employees if they leave early before an exit? You would typically have a vesting schedule. I'll punt that to Oren because I'm sure, or Dror because I'm sure he'll hit it. And the other question is, does the potential size or impact of an innovation impact founders' equity and deals with the university? Would a deal to license a product potentially worth 50 million look different than a deal for a product worth $1 billion? This is something that goes into what I think is more like a licensing question, which it's impactful for universities to think about all the future dilution, but generally they treat a lot of their opportunities and how they structure the licenses based on the contribution the university brought to the table. And it's very hard to judge whether opportunity is worth 50 million or $1 billion. It's really difficult to know. But the biggest thing is, will the company be able to deliver on that? And so it's hard to really say and answer that question specifically. Someone asked about equity share for professors, and I will get to that in a second. So as you think about specifically assigning equity to your co-founders, it's just good to have a simple mental model. You want to incentivize and reward past performance. These are the people that helped build the body of research. They got the bones and the infrastructure set up. They came up with a seminal discovery, and you want to reward them. These are the inventors of the IP, not in the lab today, but maybe some IP that's being brought into the company from a decade before that's just continued on through the lab, through the professor's work and previous graduate students that they've had. And you might reward some of them with ownership in the company. Oftentimes, this is the case. Professors have a body of work, their life's work that's being licensed into the company, and that needs to be rewarded, as well as the graduate students that were involved in the work. But you also need to incentivize future performance. And there are very few university startups that I've seen ever exit in less than 5 to 7 years. Really, these are like 7 to 10 year journeys. And that's a long time, even compared to the research that went into the company beforehand. And it's incredibly stressful. It requires an immense number of new skills that are completely separate from what you as a professor or graduate student or postdoc learned in the lab. And so these are the things you have to have in mind when you're setting up your founder's equity. What did this person do in the past? What are they going to do going forward? And oftentimes, this is the misalignment that creates really interesting discussions amongst faculty and graduate students and postdocs, because there's a tension and it's really hard. And there's also an asymmetric relationship that we've tried to help with when we speak with universities. And we ultimately created some of the data that you're about to see that helps you benchmark what we've invested in. So I think that answers a couple of the questions that I'm about to hit. There's a question on benchmarks, cash versus equity incentives for employees and consultants. I'll get to some of that too. So what we did at OUP, because so many tech transfer officers and researchers said like, hey, what's fair? We went through our portfolio of around 130 university spinouts and tried to create benchmarks. And so we looked at the founding cap tables of our companies, and we created some summary data of what their founders' equity allocations looked like. And not every startup's the same. So even two startups with the same number of founders has different nuances than others. Some may have a professor who is a Nobel laureate and has been working on a project for 30 years. Some may have an invention or IP that the professor really didn't help with at all. But what we tried to do is break things up into a couple buckets. One, how many founders were involved in the company? Was there a true founding CEO involved? Not always external, but someone that really stepped up and was the early founder. And also, was it a full-time? Did the faculty member involved in the startup plan on joining the company full-time, or were they planning on joining the company part-time? There's a very specific nuance there, because working full-time at a startup is very different than working 1 day a week at a startup, as many of you may know. And then also, what were some of the other founders that received equity, and what was the university's allocation? Universities, because they're licensing to a startup and not Samsung and Intel and GSK, they actually like to be a part of the upside too, and so they'll ask for equity in those companies in lieu of the upfront cash that they may receive in licenses to normal large corporations. So we did all of this number crunching and tried to come up with a summary view for everyone. And some of the tidbits of data that we found were, pretty obvious. One is that founders committed to full-time roles are just given more equity. You don't need to have equity be equal. If there's 3 founders, you don't need to have each of you own 33% of the company. It's just not the right way to do things because of all the things I described earlier about parasitic founders. Usually, there's one person that is just stepping up and doing more. And I think it's a good thing to have that. You want that person who has the passion to get beyond the research, to do HR, to do the Excel sheet on budgets, that's, not rocket science, but it takes a lot more work than just continuing on with the research that you were doing at the lab. And so it's really important to be willing to do that asymmetric ownership, but also that incoming CEO that had nothing to do with the research, but they are really compelling and charismatic, they may receive just as much equity or more than the inventors involved in the company. And that person is worth their weight in gold if you can find them. It's not easy to find that person that deserves equal ownership or more to the founding researchers, but if you can get them, you should. The other thing we found was that 10 of the 63 founding CEOs in our data set were previously a professor or a graduate student. So it's not often.
So I already want to click off. I already want.
Sorry about that. Go ahead. I
Oh.
muted them.
Okay, so this is difficult, but not all researchers end up being CEOs, and some of the ones that we've invested in have had qualities that make them great CEOs. But in general, this is just our biased portfolio of companies that we've typically invested behind teams that can bring in CEOs from the outside and help the company forward. Or in some cases, we've invested in the PIs, the researchers who can become CEOs and are CEOs. And when they do, they receive a bit more of the ownership of the company. And so this is a really, really difficult decision and discussion. But we think this data just helps have a constructive discussion. And the main thing is, if you can't have this discussion with your founders, then you're probably not set up on a path to succeed. And so everyone should be having this type of transparent discussion with their co-founders. The other thing that we noticed was in the life science versus tech world, very few life science PIs end up becoming the CEOs of their companies. And it has to do with two things. One, our portfolio is biased with therapeutics, drug discovery startups. There's a healthy amount of entrepreneurship from the industry coming to run university spinouts after their repeated successes. In the tech world, this just doesn't happen as much. And the skills are a little more natural to building a tech company. So we do see some professors come on as CEOs and do a great job. And the other last thing I'll mention is, there's a really, relevant need to bring in, let's call it PR via your professor or your PI. And so some professors who have...
You fat bitches need to shut the...
I'll keep going. So some professors end up having a really great platform to help the company going forward. And even if they're not going to be full-time at the startup, they end up receiving a little bit more equity than a normal part-time PI founder. And that's okay, because there's value that they bring to the table beyond just the work that they're doing on a daily basis. So the last thing I'll just work through here is kind of what we use as like a general guideline that's been helpful for our startups that we work with, that we think about investing in, and some of the spinouts that we speak with over time at OUP, of just the ranges to consider when you're building your company. And this is pre-venture. You haven't taken a single dollar from angel capital, and what you would do, ignoring options. And so generally, if you have a founding CEO at the company, it could be the PI, it could be the graduate student, it could be someone external. Think of them in this 30% ownership bucket. But now, for most of you on the call, I imagine many of you are founding inventors, founding researchers thinking about building your company. And you can have many. You can have one founder, you can have two, you can have three, you can have four. But if you're all full-time, you're kind of each in this 10 to 40% category. And that's probably obvious to some of you. This isn't that helpful. What I hope is going to create a good conversation is when you're a part-time inventor in the company, part-time founder, probably part-time faculty member who wants to contribute to the company, but you can't leave your day job at the university, or you just don't want to. And even though you've had your life's work in the company, it doesn't put you in this category of, let's call it 10 to 40% ownership usually. It's typically in this 5 to 10% equity position is what we've seen in our portfolio. Once again, this is our portfolio of over 100 companies. And And that
Manny, sorry to interrupt. What's the difference between part-time faculty founder and founding inventors like professor? Like, what's the difference there?
So I think of the founding inventors are the people that are going to be working at the company full time. It's their job. And it's kind of like full stop. It's their job. They're employed. They've taken a leave of absence from the university. If they're a professor, if they're a graduate student, they've pretty much finished their PhD, and this is their only job. Part-time can mean many things. It can mean almost nothing. It can also mean a lot of the universities that we work with have this sort of 20% of their time budget that professors are able to allocate to outside work, and it could be in that bucket. And so you kind of just have to have that discussion of what the faculty member's contribution is going to be.
I also have one question here. So what's a vesting schedule for this? Like, for example, for the founding CEO or founding inventor. So are they going to get like these percentages immediately, or there will be like vesting plan for them as well?
Yeah, I'll let Dror hit that, but it's basically a vesting schedule is with founders equity, it's a little different than vesting of options, but it's Dror, why don't you comment on the right structure for it?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is there's kind of a notion of credit for time served, which varies deal to deal. A lot, again, the same motivations, I'll discuss it more in my presentation, the same motivations of kind of essentially creating golden handcuffs exist here as well. And what you want to do is kind of balance the amount of equity they have free and clear, whether the amount they're still earning. So you'll have some notion of in other words, typically I will never advise founders to have vesting, kind of voluntarily impose vesting on day one. It'll be kind of imposed at the time of an equity financing. And at that point, depending on how long they've been at it, what they put in it, whether they contributed a significant amount of personal funds, there'll be a bucket that will likely be vested completely on day one, but there'll still be some kind of earnout period to make sure they have an incentive to kind of keep on plugging away and grow the company.
And so the other buckets are this university bucket, which we've seen range at this founding time from like 3 to 12%. This is just the math. It really depends on what the university has contributed to the body of IP, and it could be massive, several $1 million type contributions that the university has made to something more along the lines of a body of patents that have been required some resource investment for the tech transfer office. And remember, they're doing this and they're asking for equity because they're not asking you for a large upfront payment like they can normally get from a large corporation. Then after this, there's the things you may be thinking about doing in hiring other people into your company after you've set up the options and the founder's equity. And the main things to think about are, general early engineers, maybe 1%. Especially if they're like a lead engineer or director, engineers 0.5% or so. But then you also may have independent advisors that are really valuable to your company, possibly a board member that is really going to be bringing value to the company through their customer connections and experience. And those people may be worth about 1% of your company. And the biggest slug will come as a group of academic founders when you end up finding that, if you end up finding that great CEO that you want to bring into the fold. And after your first founding structure, your first bunch of hires, you're not going to give them 40% of your company, but it may be something along the lines of 5 to 10% or a little bit more, depending on what they bring to the table. And so be prepared to hire someone in that CEO slot and have to incentivize them with equity. And it aligns everything. If you give them equity and don't give them a huge salary, they're building the company for the big exit. There's so many questions. I'll just pause after this next
Manny,
slide.
Manny, can you go back to the prior slide? I just want to add a thought. It's important to kind of focus in on the numbers at the bottom of this slide, because one of the really repeating things I see with founders is over generous early equity grants, and these numbers represent high water marks, because going forward, as there's more investment in the company, there's more outstanding stock, these numbers will only shrink. But that person who's a really helpful web designer on day one, who you're giving equity to because you can't afford to pay them. And by the way, you got to pay them something, discussion for another day. But what you end up with is you're kind of wondering why Bob has 1% of the company at exit, and everybody's kind of wondering what Bob did. Not unlike the parasitic founder. Now Bob may still be with the company, but Bob is a more or less fungible resource. So a lot of times I see companies that come to me with cap tables and option grants that just don't link up with the contribution historically, the potential contribution, and the uniqueness of the individual. And at the end of the day, basic rule of investing, those mistakes are going to come on the backs of the founders, because investors are going to basically say, listen, this is the piece of the company I want to own after the dust settles on this financing. Whatever you did in terms of your option grant, and we're going to want an option grant, a refresh of the option pool to incentivize new hires. So whatever mistakes you made going forward, you own them. This is the company I want going forward.
Completely agree.
And just one more question, sir. So these numbers for the founding inventors are assumed that they are not getting compensated financially, right? Only by equity.
No, we still want our founders to get paid.
I see.
Everyone's got to eat.
I was going to say, starving founders are not helpful.
Right. But, in this world, you're not going to get a salary that you could get on the free market. So please pay yourself, but be scrappy. Don't pay yourself too much. I mean, we just invested in a seed company in a seed stage company in Santa Barbara, where the CEO had been plugging along for several years at a salary. I'm not going to say the numbers, but we invested, and one of the first things we did was, and we loved it. Like one of the reasons we invested, because they'd stretched their budget for a while. They've been really scrappy, but one of the first things we did was double his salary. And so we want them to be comfortable. So I'm going to just, in the spirit of time, I'll say, like, when you think of faculty members and the research team that's staying at the university, what they can do for the company going forward, there's a lot. And a lot of it comes in the platform that they have at the university and the ability to leverage the research that they're doing there to continue to benefit the company. And there's lots of things to sort out conflict of interest for that, but universities know the best way to do it and work with your tech transfer on it, because that stream of research can be really important. The stream of talent from the faculty members' lab can be really important, as well as the connections they have to industry can be incredibly important. The most valuable thing I can do as an investor for our companies, I've found, is introduce them to customers. Faculty members, through their research, have lots more connections to potential customers and talent than most any investor. So it's definitely things to be thinking about benefiting from as you continue to work with the research group you spun out of. This is more of a longer discussion, but I just wanted to highlight one thing on this slide, which is, this is a fictitious kind of general thought of how a company gets diluted over time in their ownership. And this bucket of the dark blue and the dark green, 60% at the seed stage, is something that's roughly the ownership you might have over time at the seed stage. But the impact of dilution, you raise your Series A, a $5 million raise at a 10 pre, next round 15 on 45, Series C, next round 20 on 80, and ultimately your ownership, which may have started around 100% before the seed round, between the sets of founders is only 24%. And that's okay, because if you're $1 billion company, that is still a life-changing amount of money. And you never would have gotten there if you hadn't raised this capital, or it would have been really hard to get there. And so you have to hire employees to give up equity. You generally have to take venture dollars and give up equity. But that's generally how we think of things, is like, you need to be willing to give up some equity and have a small piece of a big pie. It's much better than having a big piece of a small pie usually. And that's kind of the world that we live in venture, and how we think of founders' equity. So I'll stop there. Maybe I'll scan through some of the questions while I close the slides and hand the mic to Dror, if everyone's okay with that. Feel free to pipe in with verbal questions too. One of the questions was, how does the share of university economics that goes to the inventors on the patents impact allocation of equity for founders. We stay out of, as venture investors, we stay out of that. What I do like about the way the university allocates university economics, just to be clear, so these are the dollars associated with the license that universities receive, either through royalties or equity cash outs, get distributed amongst many different pools in the university. It depends on the university. One of those streams is to the inventors of the IP that was licensed. And what I love about it is it gives some of that upside with inventors that had nothing to do with the company. So it's a way for inventors who had to make the tough decision to not join the startup to ultimately get some of that capital back. But it's really hard to account for that in how equity is distributed. So we usually don't factor that in.
Okay, thank you so much, Manny. Dror, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, we're seeing it.
Dror, you're on mute.
Okay, well, so I'm an attorney, and I'm sure you wouldn't feel fulfilled if I didn't have a disclaimer. So here it is. What I'm going to tell you now is not the opinion of my firm. It might not even be my own opinion. If you do have a legal question, get a good lawyer. Okay, what I want to kind of distinguish is between founders equity and what we're going to talk about in terms of other equity grants to team members. I often get founders come to me and say, I want founders equity. So that begs the question, and Manny touched on it in terms of who really is a founder, who are kind of those key, 1, 2, 3 people that are going to drive a company forward. And it always cracks me up when somebody asks for founders equity because it's not such a big bargain. Founders equity is common stock. It doesn't really have any rights attached to it. What founder stock delivers to the founder is a lot of shares delivered at next, minimal or no price. So it's a pure volume play. And so when founders say, "Oh, I want founder stock," it's like it's not the best thing in the world to get, but hopefully the story works out. There is an exception, which you see for kind of mostly superstar founders, where you actually create a separate founders equity class. That's really rare, and in a market like this, becoming rare. And again, when you're trying to crown somebody a founder, you have to kind of really, the first 4 people in a company, you may call each other founders, but the reality is in most founding teams, you're going to have a differential of potential contribution and skill set that makes some subset of that clearly founders, and other ones are helpful early team players. So in transitioning to kind of broader option questions, let's think about it conceptually in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. So with compensation, we're trying to recruit people. We're trying to motivate them, in other words, pay for their performance there, and we're trying to have a mechanism to retain them. And when you think about kind of the tools in the toolkit to accomplish those goals, for recruitment, you're looking at salary, benefits, perks. Motivation, typically you're looking at bonuses and commissions, which ventures are always watching cash flow tend to be light on. And then retention is really the biggest tool, which is equity. And so you want to always have your best employees having a significant number of shares that are still unvested to keep them motivated to stay around and contribute to the team. There are kind of big picture 4 common forms of equity grants. We'll focus on the 2 most common, but stock options, restricted stock options, restricted stock units, and stock appreciation rights. It's restricted stock awards. We'll focus on the first 2. In stock options, essentially, you're being given the right to purchase a certain number of shares at a predetermined exercise price. And usually for certain tax advantage reasons, typically the exercise period after somebody leaves a company is 90 days. That's actually changing with a lot of companies now to a mode where they have an extended period to exercise, which is not as tax advantaged as those same options exercised within that 90-day window. But the key thing is with options, until the options are exercised, the option holder has no rights as a shareholder. They are off the cap table other than being noted as part of an option pool, but they don't participate in the economics of the company. They don't participate in any of the voting of the company. They have a right to purchase. Restricted stock, you actually give the stock to the employee, either in an outright grant or a purchase for some nominal consideration. Now, the issue is that when you grant an employee stock, the grant becomes taxable on its date. So it is then based on the fair market value of the company. And in general, given the high risk of early stage companies, investors prefer not to pay a big tax load for a company that, let's be frank, an early stage company has a not insignificant likelihood of failure. So the reality is you typically see restricted stock awards only at the very early stage when the company can fairly take the tax position that the value of the company is nominal. And just like in the option world, you'll have vesting on the stock, which is what Manny mentioned earlier. Mechanically, it's achieved in a slightly different way from option vesting. Okay, you'll hear a lot of times terms floated: ISO or qualified stock options and non-qualified stock options. In the category of more tax than you probably wanted to know, here's a nutshell on the conditions. Only employees can get ISOs. So consultants, advisors, they have to get non-qualified stock options. As long as the exercise price of the options corresponds to the fair market value of the company, in neither case is the grant of the option a taxable event to the recipient, which is in contrast to the restricted stock award. Vesting does not create a tax liability. Theoretically, it does with a restricted stock award. There were ways around that with what's called an 83B election. Is the option taxable upon exercise? This is the big advantage of an ISO. It's not taxable upon exercise, whereas with a non-qualified stock option, the gap between the strike price and the value at the time of exercise is taxable. And then in both cases, when the stock is ultimately sold, that transaction is taxable, though in the case of the non-qualified option, you essentially get credit for taxes already paid. So you're only paying taxes on the appreciation from the exercise date. And this also, this issue in terms of stock holding periods for long-term capital gains versus short-term capital gains, until the option holder actually owns the stock, that clock doesn't start ticking. And that's identical in both cases, but has different consequences because of the fact that ISOs give you an incentive to kind of hold on closer to exit, whereas in not qualified stock options, there might be rationales where you might exercise earlier. And so one takeaway point here is when you're dealing with employee equity grants, there's a tax clock ticking. Because if, God forbid, your company is actually doing well, its value is increasing. And that either means if you're granting stock, the amount the employee is going to be taxed on is going to be increasing, and at a certain point it becomes impractical. Or if you're giving options, the strike price is constantly rising, which means the options are not as valuable. So I'll have somebody come to me and say, listen, we want to bring on Bob. We want to see how he works out. We don't want to give him a grant for a year. And I'm like, no, give Bob the grant now. Let's have vesting conditions on it that will address your concern. But the point from a tax perspective is to get the option or get the stock into Bob's hand as early as possible. And one big no-no, people went to jail over this. options can't be backdated. You can't recreate history. So I had somebody who called me and said, I promised Bob, stock a year ago. We never made the grant. Stock was worth nothing at the time. Can we paper it over? And I'm like, no, flat out no. I mean, in fact, actually, there's somebody who lives 2 blocks from me who almost went to jail in the bubble period for attempting to backdate a stock grant. That's a big no-no. It has to be fair market value at the time of the grant. Manny covered dilution pretty well, so I'm going to skip over this. Dilution hits all shareholders, but because option holders are holding common shares, founders are holding founder stock, and that's all common stock, they're sitting at the bottom of the stack. And if future investment is always going to have a liquidation preference, and so a bigger and bigger, in addition to the absolute dilution, a bigger and bigger stack of liquidation preference is now sitting between them and getting an exit return. And quite frankly, given some of the amounts raised recently, and the liquidation preferences that resulted, and now the drop in valuation, I posted on LinkedIn a couple of days ago. In 2021, a bunch of founders sold their company and were really happy about it, and they didn't even realize that they had sold it for nothing, because the value of their common equity has become zero. And even if they're nominally on the cap table as 30, 40, 50% owners, the liquidation preference stack will never be cleared. And so you're starting to see a rise in what are called management carve-outs, which are bonus plans that seek to address that issue created. But it's something to watch out for when you're a founder. In terms of vesting, the typical vest, majority of cases, is a 4-year vest with a 1-year cliff, which means nothing vests for a year. 25% vests at that anniversary, and the balance vests over 36 months. There are exceptions, which I discussed a couple of minutes ago. We're giving people credit for time served. The 4 with a cliff is generally the industry norm. There's a bit of more variability around acceleration. So what happens if there's an exit event and not all your stock is vested? You kind of have a couple of different situations. So termination without cause will either stop vesting or maybe even unvest shares previously vesting. On an acquisition, you may have some acceleration or full acceleration. There's a bifurcation between single trigger acceleration, which is an exit happens, you're vested, and double trigger acceleration, which means company's acquired and blank happens within Y month. So your job title is changed, you're asked to change offices, your responsibilities are reduced. These are all things that might constitute a basis of a double trigger. The double trigger is really designed to keep you employed after an acquisition, and so it creates incentives for the employee, and on the other hand, saves the buyer the need to create new incentives for you. And then there are situations where there's some measure of acceleration, or what's called a good leaver situation. Somebody is not terminated for cause, but is laid off otherwise, and you might have some kind of accommodation there of some amount of vesting that accelerates on that situation. And that's all that I plan to talk about. There's a link in the last slide to an article that discusses a bunch of these topics at greater depth. And also, feel free, my email's on the first page of this presentation, which I understand we're going to be circulating to ask any questions. I'll look at the questions in the chat.
Thank you so much, Manny and Dror, for the very insightful presentation. Yeah, why don't we go ahead and answer some of the questions here. I think one question is going to be answered live is from Alex. Thank you for the benchmarking data. Is there some type of mediation or advisory service for determining equity in unusual circumstances?
So the short form answer is, I'm not aware. I mean, I think a lot of executive recruiters have a fair amount of anecdotal experience that you might tap, and also it often can be more relevant to a specific geographic market where there are different behaviors. And actually, to tie in to Alex's question at 11:22, so actually the way Manny and I met, Osage had one of the few real surveys of employee equity that I was able to find anywhere out there. And they continue to do a great job of collecting that data. It is a little, let's call it, skewed because the university world is its kind of own ecosystem with its own drivers. But I still think it's very good in terms of setting kind of directional ranges, even for non-university spin-out companies. Carta has been accumulating more and more of this data, so that's another tool that's out there. But this is still a fairly opaque market. Also, one of the really interesting things is, while we're talking about percentages, a lot of companies actually don't share what percentage their option grants represent to their employees. And it's actually, industry secret. One of the reasons why cap tables are denominated in millions of shares, because if 10 shares equals 0.1% of the company, or if 10 shares, or if 10,000 shares equals 0.1% of the company, employees kind of just feel better when they get 10,000 shares, and even more so if they actually don't understand the underlying percentage. So, senior key recruits, Manny, you might have different experience, will kind of have the right to figure out exactly what they're getting. But for a lot of the junior recruits in the venture space, they'll get a number, and that's going to be the end of the story.
Right. Yeah, I find it. I've had friends that come and say, "Hey, I got 5 million shares in the equity grant to join the startup." And I said, that doesn't mean anything. Like, you get a billion share cap tables.
I also have one question. Thank you for putting a lot of details here. So my question is, a lot of time when we want to fund a company, some stories are before funding the company, like just beside like just the founding members, like you get help from people, get support, even like just when we go to these type of I-Corps programs. So I'm wondering, how can we transfer those efforts into after funding learning? Was it clear? I don't know.
I didn't quite follow, actually.
So before we fund a company, so we go through a lot of like just probably other processes. Like just for us, we did like a regional I-Corps, we did a national I-Corps, and different people were involved. And now we funded the company, and I'm wondering, how can we transfer the efforts that have been put on this work for funding the company to the shares, or we should start after we fund the company?
After you fund the company, I still think you want to set up a structure of ownership before. Sorry, there's funding, there's founding. You should have the discussion before you found the company, and then when you found when the company's founded, you've got to have a structure in mind. If you're talking about before funding the company.
No, founding the company.
Founding. Yeah, I think those discussions should happen, but you also want to, I think you want to live in a little bit of the gray area of not knowing who's really going to be contributing to the company. In the early days that you're talking about, a regional I-Corps, where everyone's happy and excited, you wouldn't say, okay, I'm going to be the CEO, so I get 60%, you guys get 20 and 20. It shouldn't be so. You should sort of live in that shade of gray a little bit, but maybe more just have the discussion like, hey, we don't know where this is going to end up. There are going to be some of us that really step up and do this work and move forward with the company, and we think they're going to receive more, versus kind of, even if it's not in a contract, having like had a handshake on something you then have to explain later. So I think early days NSF I-Corps, it might be a little too early in the regional I-Corps to say, you get 60, I get 30. But you want to have that discussion.
Yeah, I think to Manny's point, things become evident as you work together. So the discussion of how you're to allocate things is a much easier one to have once you start having a track record of how people are contributing, how valuable their skills really are. I want to answer Hari's question. So there is a requirement under a change in the tax law from the early 2000s, section 9A of the tax code, that you have basically a basis for establishing the fair market value that you use for option grants. So a whole industry has arisen in terms of generating these 409A appraisals. Having one serves as a safe harbor in the event that the IRS were to challenge it. Best of my knowledge, and I've asked a lot of people about this for confirmation, IRS has never actually challenged a 409A appraisal. So, you know, having one is really important and seems to be a kind of a complete defense to a challenge of the value you use. At the very, very early stage, where it's kind of three people in a garage and there really isn't much there, you know, most people will feel comfortable declaring the fair market value of the company to really be next to nothing without a formal appraisal. But once the company starts taking in money, once it starts having, you know, commercial relations, it becomes tougher and tougher to take that position. One of the things that I've noticed is Carta, which is a company that a lot of ventures use to maintain their cap tables. There's been kind of a migration of earlier stage companies to Carta that might have waited a while to use the Carta platform. And one of Carta, this isn't an ad for Carta, but one of their selling points has been that as part of their annual fee, they include a 409A appraisal.
I apologize, everyone. I have to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Manny. Yeah, great. Thank you so much, everyone, and Dror especially. And in the interest of time, Mark, I'm gonna hand the floor over to you to give a quick update on our upcoming activities at I-Corps.
Yep. Great. Thank you, Dror and Manny, for your wonderful presentation. I think a lot of our innovators are interested in this topic because they are seriously considering creating the startup or understanding how their equity is going to be diluted over time. So thank you for this great information. For those of you who are who have your own innovation, are looking to explore the commercial potential of that innovation, we have an upcoming Propel Us I-Corps info session with Connie and Yasmin on Tuesday, February 27th. So the link is there. I think Vanessa could put that in the chat. Thanks, Vanessa. And that's virtual. So that's the info session for the actual upcoming April cohort, which is the deadline the deadline is March 12th for the cohort, which is going to run from April 2nd to April 26th, I believe. So again, check the link there if you want to apply. Make sure you apply by March 12th. We do have this Friday an upcoming Novice I-Corps program at Alexander Library in New Brunswick campus at Rutgers University in collaboration with the Rutgers Office for Research, NSF I-Corps Hub, and the Hatchery Innovation Studio in the lower level of the Alexander Library. Definitely, it's for individuals and teams who want to better understand how they can get started with I-Corps. It's an on-campus training workshop and networking event. So join us on this Friday morning. We also have a Propel Us I-Corps Lunch and Learn at Princeton Innovation Biolabs. So definitely register for that. Again, that too is also in person on February 22nd at 11:30 a.m. Join us there. And we are just announcing a next Innovating Together event with state economic development authorities from New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. All these amazing people and their organizations, how they help support you with programs, resources, and funding opportunities for you innovators out there who want to commercialize your technology. So definitely check that out. That's been launched on Eventbrite. We still have to post it on the website, but it's on Eventbrite if you want to register. Okay, and again, I mentioned the I-Corps Fellowship for students from underrepresented groups can also can be matched up with I-Corps teams for $1,000 stipend for contributing in a meaningful way. And I think if you registered for this event, we'll add you to the Hub newsletter, and just stay tuned for all the upcoming programs that we mentioned. And if you are interested in becoming an industry mentor for an I-Corps team or an instructor for I-Corps, check out this website, engage, become mentor. Hopefully Vanessa could put that in the chat there. And again, we are looking for more instructors to help promote our I-Corps activities. And go to National I-Corps as industry mentors. So again, we want to develop this innovation ecosystem in our whole region. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate your presence here today, and we will send the recording and the slides in a couple days or so. Stephanie, any final thoughts?
Yep, thank you so much. Thank you again, Dror and Manny. It was the presentation was very useful to Manny, and I bet we could have made this presentation 2 hours long, and we still won't run out of questions and discussion. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and I'll see you in the next I-Corps program. Thank you.